Hi everyone, I'm Kelsey from Just Sew, and this is part 2 of my quilt binding series. Today I'm going to show you guys how to complete your quilt binding by hand. There's lots of different options for binding. I'm just going to show you one of them where your stitches will be completely hidden when you're finished with your binding. So I'm starting out at the point where my binding is prepped and attached to the front of my quilt, and I'm ready to fold it over and hand stitch it closed. If you don't know how to get to this point, then I do have a part 1 of this tutorial where I show you all of the steps of connecting your binding to the front of your quilt. So this is part 2. Make sure you click the link in the description below to watch part 1 if you haven't already. A couple of the materials I'm going to be using today, obviously a hand sewing needle. I also like to have thread that matches my binding. This is part of what helps it disappear just in case your stitches do show. However, if you stitch it correctly, then none of your stitches should be showing. So just to make that a little bit easier, I do like to pick a thread that matches my binding. I usually use either 40 or 50 weight. You'll just want little scissors or thread snips handy. And then sometimes I like to also use a thimble. I'm not a huge thimble fan, but the only one that I can make myself use is this leather coin thimble. It's completely leather except for this little coin piece that goes on the pad of your finger. It's slightly too big for me, so I have some fabric stuffed up here to help. And when I'm binding for long periods of time, I like to use it, but I'm not super natural with it, so typically I don't use a thimble. But if you're looking for a one other than the classic metal thimble, this one I like a little bit better. So let's get into how to hand bind your quilt. All right, so I'm going to show you guys straight along this edge here, and then also how to do a corner. So starting off, we're going to thread our needle with our matching thread. And this part is up to you guys, but you can double up on your thread if you want it to be a little bit more secure. So instead of knotting just one end of your thread, you can knot the two ends of your thread together, and that gives you basically 2 strands. It makes it a little bit stronger. I don't always do this. I don't actually have a rhyme or reason to when I do it to when I don't. But I typically do this just because it makes me feel like while these are stitches by hand, it's still going to be nice and secure. Machine sewing can feel a lot more secure, and so this just makes me feel like my hand stitches are a little bit stronger. So I like to tie my 2 ends together here. You can clip the tail off if you want. The little tiny tail here. One tool that I forgot to mention is binding clips. So I typically only use 2 at a time when I'm binding. So if you have 2 to spare, they're really helpful, especially for getting started. And I mostly use them to hold down the stitches I just did instead of doing the stitches I'm about to do. So I find wherever I want to start, and I make sure that it's folded all the way up and there's no like crease down there. And I fold it all the way over so that it's hiding the stitches here that we use to stitch the binding to the front of the quilt. And I use a binding clip to hold that down, and that just helps with the tension so that when you're stitching, your stitches don't want to like pull out before they're very secure. So I take my first stitch with my knot up here to hide it, and then from now on, what you want is you want all of your stitches to be close together. So you want to picture this like you're doing one line of stitching, but 1 stitch is in the binding and 1 stitch is in the quilt, and you're going back and forth, but you want them to be very small and close together as if it is one continuous line of stitches. And you also want your the very edge of your binding to be secure and it to go over these stitches right here. So I take my first bite into my binding, just a small stitch on the edge, And then I take a small bite into the quilt right below that stitch line. And I want those stitches to be relatively the same size, and I don't want there to be a space or distance between them. And then as I work, I kind of fold over my binding and see where this last stitch ended, and I go right up there to that same spot, but on my binding. And you want to make sure you're only going through one layer of your binding so it doesn't show on the other side. And then we go down here into the quilt, and you can kind of feel as you sew in the quilt when you are into the batting, and that's okay, but you don't want to go through to the other side. So you kind of want to feel that out as you go with your fingers on the back. Small stitch, small stitch. So the position of my hands here when I'm doing this, and I move my clip along with me so that it holds those stitches in place as I continue. The movement of my hands here is I have my first finger and my thumb pinching my binding so that I can easily fold it over or fold it up. So I fold it over to see where my last stitch was, and then I fold it up, take a little stitch, and then I use my needle to bite into the quilt. So you're basically just taking 2 stitches at a time. I think it'd be hard to take any more than that, but you could try if you get ambitious. And we're working our way over here to the corner. All right, so we have made it to the corner. You want to make sure that it's nice and poked out here. This part is poked out. And we want nice, sharp lines. So what we're going to do is we want our binding to look like this as we finish this line of stitching. So right here, this will probably be our last stitch, like this. All right, so now we're going to turn over the other side. This is when my second binding clip comes in handy. I make sure it's out nice and flat right here, nice and straight, and then I fold it over. And when you fold, what you want is for those points to match up right there. Okay? So this is another reason that I like to use thread that matches my binding, is you could just continue your stitches along this side, but again, hand binding feels a little less secure to me, even though I enjoy the process of hand quilting more than hand binding more than machine binding, and I also like the finished outcome more. Sometimes I'm afraid it might not be as secure, and so I like to do as many things as I can to make it feel more secure, and this is one of those things. I just want to take a little tiny stitch in here to secure this corner and make sure that it closes and that these corners fully meet. So I just do that like 2 or 3 times. And when you're using 2 strands of thread, this can happen. You just want to even them back out so that there's no loops. Like that. Make sure these stitches are nice and closed. Okay, so there's my corner. And I like to leave that wonder clip on just while I continue. So to continue our stitches from the corner here, whenever you come across these loose threads from the raw edge of your quilt, you can cut them off or you can hide them into the binding, whatever you prefer. I'm just gonna hide them in for now to save time. So your thread is coming out of the left side now. And so we're going to go back into the same hole that you just made to whip stitch this corner shut. And we're going to come out underneath right here so that we can take our next stitch into the binding. So now we just take our next stitch right here, and into the quilt. And now you can just continue along this side like we did over here by taking one little stitch into the binding and one little stitch into the quilt. And there you have it.